Hey everyone, we're going to give folks another minute to join and then we'll get started soon. Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Carlo Ng and I'm the Director of Legal Initiatives at the National Alliance for Safe Housing, or NASH for short. We are so excited to be launching our new website, which is VAWAhome.com. It provides lots of resources and tools on the housing rights of survivors in the federal low-income housing tax credit program. And today I'm joined by my fellow presenters and partners at Regional Housing Legal Services in Pennsylvania. They're Rachel Blake, who is the Associate Director there, and Vanessa Raymond Garcia, who is the Policy Analyst. My colleague Jenny Herget, who is NASH's Operations and Communications Manager, is also here with us, making sure that all of our tech runs smoothly. So thanks so much, Jenny. We appreciate you so much. And just so y'all know, we are recording today's webinar and we're going to be sending the webinar recording as well as the PowerPoint to everyone who registered after the presentation. So just in case folks always have questions about if we're going to get the PowerPoint or the recording, you will definitely be getting links to those materials. Right. So what's on the menu today? So we'll start by providing you some background on the project. We'll give you a brief tour of the website and then provide some scenarios that illustrate how different folks can use our website. We're going to have a scenario that is survivor-based, one that is from a survivor advocate's perspective, as well as housing providers' perspective, so that you can see how different folks can use the various features of the website. And then at the end, we'll explain the kinds of technical assistance and research support that we can provide for you. So I'm at NASH. National Alliance for Safe Housing provides technical assistance, training, and support to advocates across the country on housing and homelessness issues impacting domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. We also work on national policy issues impacting survivor safety in housing. If you'd like technical assistance support on any issues related to VAWA or other kinds of issues, you can feel free to visit us at nashta.org. It details more about the scope of our work, and there's a link that you can use to contact us if you would like to file and submit an inquiry. Next slide. So our partners at RHLS will introduce you to the organization.
So hello, everyone. This is Rachel Blake from Regional Housing Legal Services. We are a statewide program in Pennsylvania. We're a legal services program that focuses on affordable housing and community development. Our attorneys represent nonprofits that are engaged in affordable housing and community development work. And then we also have a number of folks who focus on policy, which runs sort of the gamut. This is one of the examples of the kind of work that we do. Back to you, Carlo.
Thanks. And here are some lovely headshots of the speakers along with their email addresses. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. And if you have more questions, you are, of course, welcome to email us or submit an inquiry through the new website, the VAWAhome.com website, which we'll talk about how to do that today as well. Next slide. Alrighty. So why did we start this project? What was the impetus? So the project has actually been in the making for about 8 years, and it really started in 2013 when the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, for the first time required housing protections for survivors who were applying for or living in low-income housing tax credit units. And then shortly after VAWA 2013 got reauthorized, we were getting more and more questions from advocates about survivors that were in tax credit units and who were facing a lot of housing problems. They were getting evicted, they were facing terminations, or their landlords weren't doing anything about requests related to emergency transfers and requests for lease bifurcations. And so the advocates that we were working with were asking us, well, what is the low-income housing tax credit program? Why isn't HUD involved? Who are the players? And how can we get these landlords to do what survivors need in order to obtain safe and stable housing? So those conversations inevitably led us to talk about, issues related to whether VAWA applied to these survivors and who exactly was responsible for ensuring that survivors got VAWA housing protections and other related state and local protections. Well, many survivor advocates were surprised to learn that the tax credit program was actually administered by the Internal Revenue Service. That's still the agency that administers tax credit program, and not the usual suspects of the federal agencies that generally administer affordable housing. So you think of HUD or USDA's Office of Rural Development as sort of the general entities that govern the federal affordable housing programs. But in the low income housing tax credit program, it's the IRS. Advocates were even more surprised to learn that the IRS had not done anything to implement VAWA's housing protections in the tax credit program. And what that practically meant and continues to mean is that tax credit owners and landlords have no idea how to comply with their VAWA responsibilities. And we'll talk more about that as we talk a little bit more about VAWA's protections today, but I just wanted to provide that context as we move forward. Next slide, please. So why is the failure to implement the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, in the low-income housing tax credit program such a big deal? Well, first of all, the tax credit program is huge. It's a huge program that produces the most affordable housing units in the country. Every year, the program churns out about 100,000 new units and puts them on the market. And since the program's inception in 1986, the program has created more than 3 million units total nationwide. So this map here shows where these units are located throughout the country. As you can see, there are greater concentrations in the eastern half of the United States. And generally speaking, the program involves a public-private partnership between the government and housing developers. And the way that the program works is that it leverages private capital to fund the development and preservation of affordable housing. And unlike other housing programs that we're generally used to, the tax credit program does not provide any direct housing subsidies to tenants. So instead, what it does is that it provides tax incentives written into the Internal Revenue Code to encourage developers and investors to create or rehabilitate affordable housing. So it's a different framework that we're working with. They're not direct subsidies. It's these tax credits that are being used in exchange for essentially the housing providers to keep the units affordable. Next slide, please. Like I mentioned before, so we're going to talk, let me see if, okay. So like I mentioned before, in 2013, the Violence Against Women Act for the first time provided housing protections for survivors in the tax credit housing program. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the IRS administers the LIHTC program. Treasury has not implemented the housing protections under the Violence Against Women Act, and that this failure essentially led to the failure for housing providers to implement VAWA across the country. I'm sorry, Jenny, can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, sorry. So in the tax credit program, there are a number of VAWA protections that apply. And so here I've listed out sort of graphics that are part of our website where we list out all of the protections that apply. A really important footnote here is that the VAWA reauthorization is actually happening right now, the reauthorization of VAWA in 2021. So as part of VAWA 2021, there are significant housing protections that are new to VAWA that right now the House is voting on as we speak. Some of the new protections include protecting survivors from retaliation by housing providers, protecting the right to report crime and emergencies from a survivor's home. There's actually a creation of a new pool of emergency transfer vouchers that will be especially for survivors who need to seek safe and stable housing. And there's also provision that ensures that survivors can terminate their leases early for safety reasons without penalty. And just so you know, even if VAWA does not get reauthorized, so 2 years ago, VAWA was supposed to be reauthorized, even if it, for some reason, it doesn't get reauthorized, although we think that it will get reauthorized this year, it does not mean that VAWA's housing protections are not in effect. So VAWA's protections, as we laid out here, are going to continue to be on the books. They're going to continue to protect survivors in tax credit housing and other kinds of housing, no matter whether or not the reauthorization happens this year. It's really important to remember because there are a lot of housing providers out there, as well as survivor advocates, that are very confused about what happens if VAWA does not get reauthorized. And basically what happens for the purposes of the housing protections, those are still on the books. Okay, so VAWA's housing protections as they exist right now include all of these protections. This is not an exhaustive list. This is sort of a truncated list, but it's here generally for your information. But VAWA generally protects survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking from being denied admission into a tax credit unit because of the violence committed against them. They cannot be evicted from a tax credit unit because of that violence. They cannot be denied admission or eviction for reasons related to the violence. So think of situations where a survivor has an eviction record or criminal history or bad credit history because of the violence, and that is why they're being denied housing. Those reasons cannot be reasons why a survivor is denied housing under VAWA. A survivor must also be able to stay in their tax credit housing, even if there's been criminal activity directly related to the violence. They have to be able to have emergency transfers or safety moves under VAWA if they don't feel safe in their unit. If the survivor has a Section 8 housing choice voucher, so this is the mobile voucher that moves with the tenant if they choose to port with the voucher or go to another jurisdiction to use the voucher. A survivor who has that voucher must be able to move with continued assistance. And a survivor must be able to provide proof if written proof is requested by their provider by self-certifying using the HUD VAWA self-certification form. They also have the right to receive a notice of VAWA housing rights in the HUD self-certification form at three different junctures: when they're denied admission to a tax credit unit, when they're admitted to a tax credit unit, and when they receive notice of eviction from a tax credit unit. There's also a specific right to strict confidentiality of information, and there's also an ability to request a lease bifurcation to remove the perpetrator from the lease. Okay, so let's go back, Jenny, to the other slide, 7. Thank you. Okay, so despite all these important housing protections, one of your questions is probably, well, we have all of these housing protections, so why is it that VAWA is not being implemented in the tax credit program? Well, so despite all of these important housing protections, the failure for the IRS to implement VAWA practically means that survivors in hundreds of thousands of tax credit units across the country are not fully accessing their housing rights. And I keep on saying that IRS failed to implement VAWA, but what does that mean to fail to implement a statute like VAWA that has significant housing protections for survivors? Well, one way to explain this is by comparing what other agencies have done. So unlike the other federal agencies that are responsible for administering affordable housing programs covered by VAWA, like HUD and rural development, the IRS never issued regulations, forms, notices, or guidance about what owners and managers should be doing to fulfill their VAWA obligations. So the IRS literally has said nothing about VAWA, despite continuous advocacy and urging from groups like ours and other groups about the dire need for VAWA implementation. So in 2016, as part of a coalition, we set out to research the impact that the IRS's failure had on the state agencies responsible for administering the tax credit program. They're also responsible for monitoring compliance by tax credit owners and managers. We sent a survey to more than 50 state agencies, asking them about the extent to which they were implementing VAWA and requiring housing providers to comply with VAWA's requirements. About half of the states replied. I think it was about 23 or 24, and which is actually a really high response rate, just to give you a little bit of background. And the responses were very interesting. The survey uncovered big differences among state agencies in VAWA implementation. Some state agencies told us that they had taken steps to educate housing providers and tenants about the rights of survivors. And they had also taken steps to monitor provider compliance. But a lot of state agencies told us that they didn't do anything. And the main reason why was really because they needed guidance from the Department of Treasury or IRS to really inform them what their obligations were. So it became quickly very obvious to us as we were going through these responses that IRS's silence was detrimental to survivors realizing their VAWA protections in the tax credit housing program. So then we then wrote a report, which you see here, that summarized the survey results. The report also highlighted different ways that state agencies could implement VAWA without any kind of IRS guidance, using tools that some state agencies were already using. So these included adopting VAWA lease addendums, adopting VAWA policies and tax credit compliance documents, sending memos to owners and landlords about their VAWA obligations, and providing VAWA trainings to owners and landlords. Next slide, please. Slide after that. Thanks. So over the next 2 years, we provided support to different state agencies to help them adopt good VAWA implementation policies. In 2018, we sent a follow-up survey to all the state agencies to see if they had made any progress on the VAWA implementation front. We were pleasantly surprised to see that there was some improvement. About the same number of agencies, around half of the state housing finance agencies responded this time. This isn't showed in the chart, but 17 of the agencies did report that they changed their compliance procedures to require VAWA compliance. And that was huge, right? Because if it's in the compliance documents and they're saying that they're requiring VAWA compliance by housing providers, that is great in terms of implementation and enforcement. And in terms of the number itself, 17, that was actually an increase from 11 state agencies in 2016 to 17. And then here you see some of our other results from the 2018 survey. 16 state agencies said that they were requiring some form of written notice to applicants and tenants regarding their VAWA housing rights. 4 state agencies said that they were disqualifying owners and managers with a history of violating VAWA. 15 said that they were including a general prohibition against discrimination against tenants based on their status as survivors. 14 included language that made clear that being a survivor under VAWA is not a good cause reason for eviction. And then another 13 discussed emergency transfer procedures under VAWA in their documents. 12 discussed lease bifurcation under VAWA, and then 5 created a process for filing a complaint about a VAWA violation, which is a huge step forward in terms of VAWA enforcement locally. Next slide, please. So here are the different opportunities that folks can get involved in terms of advocacy on the low-income housing tax credit front. This is a really handy dandy infographic that Regional Housing Legal Service created to really illustrate the different ways that survivor advocates and other advocates can get involved in helping survivors access tax credit units in their community. So here are the different options. We also discuss all of these options in the webinar series that we did at the end of last year, and the webinar recordings and materials are available to you. That's the next slide, so I can show you how to access those. But basically, there are a myriad of different options to get involved. It could be something as basic as just figuring out where these tax credit units are in your community. And by virtue of that, you can help survivors apply for tax credit units there or in other communities. You can also learn and understand more about the legal housing protections that survivors have in tax credit housing. Oftentimes, learning some of those fundamentals can really help in terms of your advocacy with housing providers that were their tax credit providers. You can also do some policy advocacy work where you're engaged with your local housing finance agency and advocate for more affordable and supportive housing units that serve survivors to address their specific needs. And because all of you all are local experts in terms of your knowing of what survivors need in housing and homelessness assistance, you are some of the best advocates to really work with the housing finance agency to tell them, these are our needs. How can we really target the tax credits so that we can build housing for survivors? Some local organizations all have the resources and time to be a developer or co-developer of housing for survivors. There are a couple of examples. in certain states where local programs, domestic violence programs, have actually become co-developers with a nonprofit organization or other entities to develop tax credit units that are specifically for survivors in their communities. And there also have been a number of other kinds of partnerships that have emerged with local domestic violence sexual assault programs, where the local programs are essentially offering support services to residents in the entire tax credit complex. Sometimes they're targeted to survivors, but other times they're general services. Some of these partnerships have been quite creative, where the value of that the local domestic violence and sexual assault agency adds to the partnership is really significant. So sometimes, for example, the local program can offer certain classes to tenants of the entire building to help teach them to be good tenants. Like, what does it mean to be a good tenant? How do you follow your lease obligations? Sometimes they can also offer financial management courses, like, if they have tenants in the building who really struggle with paying the bills or paying rent or whatever, local programs have services and other tools and resources available that can benefit not just survivors, but also other residents. And that partnership can also be beneficial for the landlord and owner who are trying to be better housing providers. Next slide. This is where you can get access to the webinar recordings as well as the resources. Next slide. This is generally, when you get to that site, what the website will look like. We present the webinars as well as the materials on the right-hand side. And next slide, please. I did want to highlight this one resource because we get a lot of questions about emergency transfers in tax credit housing. So when we did the housing protections webinar, we focused on evictions and emergency transfers because those are the two biggest questions that we get in the tax credit program. And so we did have we worked with Amanda Lee Gross, who is someone who works with a lot of tax credit housing providers, and she created an advocacy flowchart that you see here for advocates who are working with survivors when they are requesting for emergency transfers in the tax credit context. The emergency transfer requests and whether or not they happen becomes a very technical question and a tax credit question very quickly, or tax question very quickly. And so this flowchart is really designed in a way that can guide someone who doesn't know a lot about the tax credit program to help them work with the landlord and help them negotiate and have a conversation with the landlord in lingo that the tax credit provider would understand, because oftentimes these decisions turn on income eligibility and related eligibility requirements. Next slide. So there on our VAWAhome.com website, if you haven't gone already, there are a number of really helpful infographics that Regional Housing Legal Services has created. This one tells you how tax credit program generally works. And then on the next slide, it shows you if you want to do some policy advocacy with your housing finance agency, this is generally how it would work. And then the next slide. Okay, great. So we really hope that you'll access the resources and take a look, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rachel and Vanessa.
Okay, hello everybody. This is Rachel Blake again from Regional Housing, and I'm gonna go over the handful of slides that give you a quick tour of the website so you sort of understand how it's structured and where you can go to get some high level questions answered. And then I'll hand it over to Vanessa, who's going to walk through a couple of scenarios along with Carlo. And then we'll tell you just a little bit about how some of the other ways we might be able to be a resource for you. So go ahead, next slide. So when you go to the website, if you haven't already gone, and I'll tell you, we have still pictures of the website here because we decided it wasn't worth the risk of trying to do it live. So we have still shots here of what you'll see when you go to some of the pages on the website. So the main thing that you need to know in terms of navigation, you get to the home page and you're going to see, what you see here, and then you can scroll down. You're going to get some basic definitions and facts, some equity related data, and there's of course the site search, which you can see, and then the menu bar. And I just want to highlight, it's highlighted in the big red square. So it's this icon that I think people call a sandwich or a hamburger or something. But if you click on that, you'll get this big pop-up to the left, and that's where all the navigation really happens. So next page. So what we do is we have a couple of sort of 101 pages. The first one is, what is VAWA? And it covers that question. What is the law? Who is covered? What the housing protections are? Where is the housing that's covered by VAWA located? So there's a lot on this one page that kind of gives you a big overview of what VAWA is and VAWA's housing protections. Next slide. And then we do the sort of LIHTC 101. So we have this map that you've seen already in our presentation that shows you where the LIHTC units are. In the United States, we have some explanations about how LIHTC works. And then we dig in just a little bit. As Carlos mentioned, it's a pretty complicated, it's a tax program. So it's very complicated. So what we do is focus on the issues that are most essential. And so for us, that meant we had to dig in just a little bit on the qualified allocation plan and compliance manual. Those are the two sort of public facing documents that really have a lot of influence and control over how the program operates in each state. So next slide. Then we tried to sort of bring those two things together. And this is really the place where we've got research that we've been doing for quite a while, trying to look at how VAWA is being implemented in LIHTC by looking at those two key documents. Carlo talked about the surveys, and that's how we started out doing this work. But to get a sort of fuller picture and to see some of those opportunities to do advocacy, which you can definitely do with the QAP, we wanted to look at the actual text for these documents in across the country. So when you get to the VAWA and LIHTC research page, if you hover over the title VAWA and LIHTC research, you'll get a pop-up that gives you 3 subpages where we look very specifically at the VAWA rights, the housing rights, and what each state is doing with respect to those housing rights. Then we look at how they're doing with respect to the best practices that we identified. And then we have that last page, LIHTC Housing for Survivors, which is focused on looking at which states are specifically incentivizing development that will benefit survivors. So you can dig into all that information. Next slide. This is the list of our best practices that we would love to see every state implementing. Next slide. We also have, if you hover over the best practices, you get this pop-up that's some QAP model language. And what we did was identified 3 states here that we thought had pretty strong language. And I want to be clear that there's a lot more to do pretty much everywhere, but this was some of the strongest language that we saw. So if you are wanting to influence what's happening in the QAP in your state, we'd encourage you to take a look at some of the language from some of these other states, because it can be really helpful to have it already written out when you make comments saying, why don't you add this? Here's this language, it exists someplace else. The state housing finance agencies do sometimes, it can matter that another state has already done something. So that's a kind of useful thing to know. So we have that there as a resource for you. Next slide. We also have an FAQ section. It has four subsections. So there's getting help, finding housing, keeping housing, and then a subset of FAQ just for landlords and state housing finance agencies. And you navigate those by clicking through the text at the top. Whatever section you're in will be the darker blue. And then you just hit the plus sign to expand to get the information or the answer or the resources. I will note that we've tried to cover quite a lot of territory in the FAQ. And if you look at a section and you think, hey, my organization does that, why aren't we listed? Please send us a note in the comments or send us a contact form, and we'd be happy to make updates. Next slide. We also have a really extensive resources section. I sort of think about this like it's kind of footnotes in some ways, like it's a lot of backup information. There's like best practices from the National Council of State Housing Agencies. There's HUD form documents. There's the reports that we've done in the past, an article that Carlo and I wrote together. There's also, I want to just point this out at the bottom of this first section, these two Novogradac links. They're a tax consulting group, and they sort of compile the QAPs and compliance manuals. So they're a really good resource if you want to go find some QAPs quick. And there's also other resources for HUD and USDA. And next slide. Okay. And then the other page we wanted to highlight is just the sort of take action page where we again pull some resources together if you're thinking about engaging in some advocacy in your state to try to push your state agency to do more for survivors. So we have the link back again to that webinar series that we did in the fall that Carlo mentioned. We have our best practices. We have a contact form so you can ask us to help or to give you more information. There's a listserv that was created specifically for this sort of set of issues. And we would love to be, a resource as much as we can. And next slide, please. I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa, and like Carlo and Rachel mentioned, I'm the policy analyst with Regional Housing. And I'm going to guide everyone through some examples that we came up with that we thought might be most pressing, given the audience here today. So the 4 different scenarios are going to include survivor perspective, 2 survivor advocate perspectives, and 1 state housing finance agency staff perspective. And yours may not fit into any of these, and that's okay. We just wanted to give you something to contextualize the website when you're traveling to and navigating the website. So to dive in, this is the first perspective, and it reads, "My partner is abusive and I do not feel safe living in the apartment that we share. I would like to move, but I am not sure what my housing options are. Who can I turn to for help?" Next slide, please. So the first thing that'll happen as soon as you land on the webpage of VAWAhome.com is you'll see this dark gray or black box at the top with some text in it. And the text reads, "If you are in danger, please use a safer computer or call a local hotline or the U.S. National Domestic Violence Hotline and it gives 2 different numbers, or 911 if it is safe to do so. Learn more about technology safety tips. There is always a computer trail, but you can leave this site quickly." So that is a message for folks who need immediate assistance and may not have time to fully peruse the website and need help immediately. So that pops up as soon as you come onto the website. But if you do have time to peruse, I would say the first place to look would be our FAQs. And in the FAQ, there's 2 different tabs that you would probably find some information, and those would be the Getting Help tab and the Finding Housing tab. And those would be the first 2. So under the Getting Help tab, you can find answers to questions like, do I qualify for VAWA's housing protections? Can I find help if I've experienced domestic violence or sexual assault or any kind of sexual violence? And finding some identity-focused support, culture, immigration, ability, LGBTQ, religion. Those are some of the ones that we've answered there. And if those don't meet your needs and you feel like there should be another one added, please let us know. And finally, how you can find an attorney to help you with your case. And then the second tab under Finding Housing, again, it will give you resources about where to find LIHTC housing and how to find it. And that's also repeated in some of the other pages that we have, but in case you need the additional resources, they're here, how you can find affordable housing that's not LIHTC, and then a few questions about citizenship, social security numbers, documented status. So those are kind of the most important things that we thought to highlight for this specific perspective and scenario. Next slide, please. Oh, and one more thing is under the resources tab, we have a bunch of resources like Rachel mentioned. We've highlighted one here for you. This is a brochure, a Know Your Rights brochure that the National Housing Law Project created. It's available in English and Spanish, and it answers some of the same questions that we've outlined. And there are some questions that we may not have answered, but are answered in this resource. And this is just one of the many countless resources that we have under the resources tab. Next slide, please. So moving on to scenario number 2. So this is a survivor advocate perspective, and it reads, an advocate that works for a local domestic violence or sexual assault program, and interested in learning how VAWA and LIHTC has been implemented in their state and how they can work with housing providers to help survivors access and stay in LIHTC housing. Next slide, please. So this is two examples of 2 maps from different sections of the VAWA and LIHTC research tab. The top map in orange is from the best practices tab, sub-tab, excuse me. And it shows states that have penalties for VAWA noncompliance. And as you can see, there's only 2 states that do that. There are other maps on that page, but we just chose one to show you kind of a difference between this example where there aren't many states that do it versus the one below that shows incentives that states give for building LIHTC housing for survivors. And so the bottom one, we've highlighted a specific state just to show you what would happen when you travel to the website and you highlight one of the states in the map. And for this specific map, it'll say are domestic violence, sexual assault survivors included in special needs or supportive housing populations in the qualified allocation plan or the QAP. And 1 is yes, 0 is no, and there's a 1 there. So it's highlighted in blue, and it tells you the name of the state and what year QAP this information came from. So this is 2020, it's the most recent. Next slide, please. So Carlo showed this infographic earlier, just showing it again to highlight the fact that this infographic that Regional Housing created will help navigate advocates through the process of commenting on the QAP and getting more protections into the language of the compliance manuals and the qualified allocation plans. Next slide, please. And finally, we just have, again, just highlighting for you the list of best practices to implement in VAWA and LIHTC, as well as the model language that Rachel talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So this is example number 3, and I'm going to hand it over to Carla because it's an immigration question, and she is the expert here on our panel for today. So Carlo, handing it off to you.
Thanks, Vanessa. So here we have scenario 3 that involves a question from a survivor advocate. So here we say, I am a survivor advocate and my organization serves immigrant survivors. We get a lot of questions regarding the kinds of housing assistance that immigrant survivors are eligible for. Can immigrants apply for tax credit housing, and how can the VAWAhome.com website help us? Next slide, please. So this is a fairly simple and also complicated question to answer. In the FAQ part of our website, we try to provide some fairly straightforward answers to a complicated question. So you'll see the 3 questions that we have laid out here that each have their own responses. So we have a Q&A about, do you have to be a US citizen to apply for tax credit housing? Do you need a social security number to apply for tax credit housing? And what kinds of housing assistance do immigrant survivors qualify for? So the straightforward answer is that there are no federally imposed immigration restrictions attached to the low-income housing tax credit program, meaning that Congress and the federal government have not created any kind of limitation related to citizenship or immigration status in order for someone to access the tax credit program. However, there have been many questions that arise from situations that are happening on the ground where there seem to be immigration requirements being imposed locally. And so the question is sort of why? One of the answers could be that, tax credit housing, much like many other forms of affordable housing, often require different layers of subsidies or financing in order to really make the units truly affordable. So a common situation is in a tax credit housing unit, you might have a Section 8 housing choice voucher recipient there as well. So it's a tax credit unit, so it's already more affordable than a market unit. But in order to truly make the rent affordable for the people living there, there's also a Section 8 voucher that the family is receiving. Now, because the Section 8 voucher is subject to its own set of immigration restrictions under a different law that's not a tax law, it's a housing law called Section 214 of the Housing Community Development Act, those immigration requirements will be imposed and will be in effect for the family that is in that tax credit unit. So you really need to look at the different layers of financing and subsidies that are at play in terms of that particular apartment or the family that's involved. So that could be an explanation. Or it could be that, the housing provider is requiring a social security number as a matter of course. It's very common for housing providers as part of their screening of applicants to also say, can we get a social security number along with other documents that we need from you? And so some of those practices might be being carried over in the tax credit program. But it's really important to remember that in the tax credit program itself, the federal government is not requiring any kind of social security number, any kind of screening that would involve someone's immigration status. If folks have questions about that, like they're seeing situations in their communities where that has become an issue, please contact us. And the third question links to a document that's on the next page. Next slide, please. Where, oh, sorry, let's do the slide after that. Sorry, Jenny. So this document, there's a website, I think, Jenny, if you can provide the website where folks can access the document. This is an article that myself and my colleagues at the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, we put together to really explain to advocates like you what kinds of assistance, housing assistance, immigrant survivors can access during the pandemic. So it includes some explanation about sort of general affordable housing programs that are around all the time, and then also specific housing assistance and rental assistance that's being paid for by all the various COVID relief packages. So it provides you information about sort of, are there immigration restrictions? To what extent are there? These are not easy questions to answer, just so you know. And for folks who are curious about the assistance that just came down, that is still coming down, but was passed through the American Rescue Plan Act, there are a lot of questions about implementation of those funding streams that have yet to be answered. So the immigration restriction questions around that have also yet to be answered. Jenny, can we go back one slide? Okay, so as part of our website, we also do have, we have all these wonderful, helpful mapping graphics that Vanessa and Rachel put together. They're just amazing and just really helpful in terms of visualizing, what currently is in play in our country and what further work needs to be done on a policy level. But here, what's really helpful is that, they've gone through all of the LIHTC compliance documents, they've gone through qualified allocation plans and other sort of tax credit documents to really help us see, where, in what states are either requiring or they're requesting social security numbers or some sort of proof of citizenship status. And so you see here the different states. It's actually quite a few. It's more than I thought that there were, that where they're either saying, this is one of the things that you need to provide or you have to provide this. So if folks have any questions, please do reach out to us if there's a particular scenario you have in mind, and we're happy to work with you and other folks locally. Jenny, can you forward to the next scenario? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Carla. So this is the last scenario, and it's someone working at a state housing finance agency that administers the LIHTC program. And they would like to do more to ensure that survivors do not lose their housing when they experience domestic or sexual violence. How can VAWAhome.com help? Next slide, please. So we would, direct this person to our FAQ, to the last tab for landlords and housing finance agencies. And under that tab, there's two questions: how can landlords help survivors? And then how can HFAs help VAWA survivors? And under the HFA question, we've expanded it for you just so you can see. So it lists the best practices that we've identified through our research, which are highlighted here on the right. You'll see that screenshot, as well as the National Council of State Housing Agencies recommended practices, also, best practices that they've identified, and we've linked to that. And, we would just say that any of these would be great to add to your compliance documents to further protect survivors in LIHTC. So next slide, please. And last but not least, technical assistance and research support. So on the research support end, we know that these documents are important, but they're also very dense and often clunky and hard to understand for, just the regular person, especially a survivor who, may be in crisis. So along with that, there's no centralized place for people to go to look at all of these documents and easily pull language or understand what the protections are. And so Rachel has worked on this for several years, trying to figure out a mechanism that works to pull language from these documents to make the analyzation of them easier and understand what is available to survivors when they need housing. And where we at Regional are very open to working with organizations that need more research support for LIHTC, for housing, for VAWA. So please, let us know if you need any of that help, as well as, TA trainings, technical assistance and trainings. So NASH and RHLS did a series of webinars in the fall, and you can see the link here. We can send that out, and we'll also email it out with the presentation. We might be able to provide some custom trainings. Let us know if you have any ideas or questions. And NASH can also provide technical assistance, trainings, and support to survivor advocates on housing protections for survivors, including VAWA. So please use the contact form on our website that you can see below. And next slide, please. It's Q&A time. So if you have any questions that we haven't answered in the chat, we'll answer them live here. And here are all of our email addresses. So please feel free to contact us through our individual emails or through the contact form. So thank you so much. And we really appreciate all of you taking the time today to be on the webinar. And we hope that the website, VAWAhome.com, is a useful resource for all of you. So thank you.
Yay! Thank you so much, Rachel and Vanessa. So we do actually have 10 minutes for Q&A. I feel like that almost never happens. When we say we're going to do Q&A, we don't have enough time, but we do today. And while people are thinking about questions they want to post into the chat box, there were a couple that came in. We did try to answer them while the presenters were talking, but maybe while we're waiting for more questions, we can just sort of elevate what we answered in the chat box and just answer them verbally. there were a lot of questions about whether we're going to get the recording and the slides to you all. Yes, we will. We promise we will send you the webinar recording as well as the slides after the presentation. Usually it takes us about 24 to 36 hours. So please be sure to be on the lookout for that. Feel free to share it with staff in your organization, outside of your organization, whatever you think is helpful, that is all allowed. So one of the questions that we got, and please let me know if I missed any questions, because I think at some point I did sort of lose the thread, and then I wasn't sure if there were questions sort of intermingled with other comments people were making. But one of the questions had to do with actually housing protections for survivors in Pennsylvania and whether there's any protection for tenants in private housing. And that is related to the fact that the Violence Against Women Act only covers federally assisted housing. So VAWA does not provide protections for survivors in any kind of unit that doesn't involve a federal subsidy. So is there anything available in private housing? And how I responded was that generally, yes, because the Federal Fair Housing Act applies, and the Federal Fair Housing Act interprets the fair housing protections to apply to domestic violence survivors under a gender discrimination theory. Meaning that because most survivors are women, if you discriminate against survivors, discriminating against women, and so therefore you're violating the Fair Housing Act. So what that means is that generally speaking, domestic violence survivors cannot be evicted, they cannot be denied housing admission because of their status as survivors and because of violence committed against them. Sort of the trickier part is what happens when survivors are not getting affirmative remedies that they would say get under VAWA, like for example, get an emergency transfer or maybe a lease bifurcation. What happens then? So it really depends on the facts of your case and sort of what is happening. I know that there were some facts provided for in the question that was posed, but we need to know more in order to really figure out, what the right approach should be. And I did want to highlight that there are certain localities within Pennsylvania, like Pittsburgh and I believe, well, Philadelphia for sure, and I believe Pittsburgh, that has their own set of housing protections that are specifically for survivors, not just domestic violence, but sexual assault and other groups of survivors. So, take a close look at those protections, because those can provide you for additional protections that the Fair Housing Act might not necessarily be explicit about. And there was a mention of a Pennsylvania bill. I've seen it. My understanding is that it might be try to be introduced at some point this year, but I'm not sure. But I really hope y'all get it introduced and that y'all get it passed, because there's some really good stuff in there. Vanessa and Rachel, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered it, Carlo. Thanks.
Okay, great. And there were some questions about Treasury's failure to implement regulations and what that means for VAWA enforcement. Again, I tried to answer that in the chat, and sometimes it's hard to sort of really tell people, what we mean. But, because Treasury has not implemented VAWA doesn't mean that, for those of us who are lawyers or who are litigators and do a lot of enforcement around lots of different statutes, including VAWA, that doesn't mean that, we can't enforce VAWA by either filing litigation in court under the Fair Housing Act and saying, hey, this housing provider is discriminating against survivors and you can't do that, so we're going to sue you, or by actually filing a HUD complaint through HUD's Fair Housing Office and trying to stop a provider from doing bad things under VAWA and also affecting future policy in terms of VAWA implementation. And it sounds like there is some intel that was shared with one of the legal service providers about maybe there's a case right now locally in Pennsylvania, which we're excited to hear more about, that involves fair housing enforcement and VAWA enforcement. Are there pro bono lawyers that can help in this area? Yes. There are lawyers that work with local organizations, whether that be fair housing organizations or legal services organizations, that typically have the expertise on fair housing and VAWA issues, and they join forces with pro bono lawyers for resource reasons to really work together to do cases. There's some pro bono lawyers that just do it on their own time. And so, yes, there are. And so if folks are curious about how to access maybe some of those resources in their localities, please let us know. And I'm not sure what the question is about HUD, so feel free to specify about that. Are there other questions that folks have? I'm sorry, my kids are also in the background doing some serious dramatic play. Did we cover all the questions, fellow presenters?
This is Rachel. I think the only thing that I would add is I think that at least one of the questions that I read looked like, it was asking, can the housing finance agencies take action when Treasury has not? And that's something I think you talked about a little bit, Carlo, and certainly some of the housing finance agencies previously in some of the surveys had told us that they didn't think that they could do anything until Treasury took action. But that's not the majority position. And in fact, there's lots of other substantive areas where housing finance agencies have taken action without Treasury giving specific guidance. And in fact, the housing finance agencies have a fair amount of discretion in how they run their programs. So I just wanted to sort of add that in as well.
Great, thanks so much, Rachel. I don't see any more new questions. Let's see. Okay, so then I think that might be it, and we can close a few minutes early. So you all have our contact information. You have access to the new website. We're also taking suggestions of how you all think we could improve on the website, whether that is improving on what's there right now, or if you have ideas. Like there was someone who did send us an idea about, possibly providing more resources on other issues related to domestic violence and housing issues. If there are ways that you think that we should grow in terms of the website and our resources, please let us know. We're open to any and all ideas. So with that, I just want to thank you all for being here today. And we hope that you have a really great rest of your day. Take care, everybody.